Good afternoon. I'm Kelly Darnell, and I'd like to welcome you to day 2 of the 2020 Bipartisan Policy Center Solution Summit, where today we will focus on children and families. Children deserve positive early childhood experiences and a strong foundation that will prepare them to grow regardless of their race, income, or zip code. Kids and families are under tremendous stress, and resources were inadequate pre-pandemic, and the crisis has revealed fragility in our childcare systems. Post-pandemic, we have a unique opportunity to build strong-based coalitions focused on supporting kids and parents. Our goal for this session is to highlight these issues and identify opportunities for real progress in a divided Congress. To kick off this session, I'd like to introduce you to our panel of distinguished guests, Dr. Lena Wen and Senator Rick Santorum. Dr. Wen is an emergency physician and a public health professor at George Washington University. She is a contributing columnist for the Washington Post and a CNN medical analyst. She's also the former health commissioner in the city of Baltimore. Senator Rick Santorum is an attorney. He's a political commentator. He also co-chairs the Bipartisan Policy Center's Task Force on Paid Family Leave. He is the former senator from the great state of Pennsylvania, and he served from 1995 to 2007. And so I'd like to kick off our conversation with Dr. Wen. Dr. Wen, given your experience in public health, what are your greatest concerns for children and parents, especially those who are low income? And what type of support do you believe will be needed post-pandemic from both the federal and state government?
Well, Kelly, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you and Senator Santorum today in discussing these important problems, as well as ideally practical solutions for us moving forward. There is no doubt that this pandemic has created many problems, but also has unearthed and unveiled many issues as well. For example, the issues of health disparities are not new, but they are certainly unmasked by COVID-19. We've certainly seen how this pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on those who are the most vulnerable. And we've also seen how the social determinants of health that those of us in public health understand are now seen for all, that health has a direct impact on the economy, that lack of food, lack of housing then also directly impact health and vice versa. And I think directly as it relates to children and families, one of the things that I'm so concerned about is the educational disparities that were already so rampant are going to be widened even more because of this pandemic. And, for understandable reasons, schools had to close. Many are still closed because, frankly, the level of virus has not been controlled in our communities. But also, we have not invested the resources that we need in many schools for them to safely reopen. I think when history is written, it will tell a story that we as a society have not prioritized our children. By us choosing other things over our children, by our society trying to have our cake and eat it, we have hurt our most vulnerable, and in particular, our children. And so I do hope that in moving forward, there are going to be short-term solutions, including a relief bill, the stimulus bill that is far overdue to help make small business owners and workers and so many people whole. And I also hope that we'll have creative solutions medium term. For example, when it comes to our children, having things like summer school or year-round school to make sure that the COVID slide does not persist into becoming a generational crisis for so many.
Thank you. Senator Santorum, in the past, you stated that the only thing that we do not talk enough about is how stable families are vitally important for the middle of America to be prosperous. And how do you believe our families are doing during this pandemic? And what would you like to see the Biden administration do to advance the interest of children, parents, and families?
Well, I think it's actually been a very interesting time, and I understand there's been a lot of problems, and we need to look at solutions. But I also think this has been a time of people resetting priorities. When people, realize as sometimes we don't, how vulnerable we are, how life is not forever, and that we have to sort of stack our priorities and figure out what's important for us. I think a lot of people realize that, hey, my family is actually really important to me, and the time that they, in some cases, were forced to spend with their children made people think a little differently. And I think that could be a positive thing coming out of this pandemic, because I do believe that the biggest crisis that we have among lower and middle income people in America is the breakdown of the nuclear family, and the fact that that the government is really not on either side of the aisle, has not, in my opinion, has not stepped up to try to help that family be stable and survive and thrive. And so I'm hopeful. That's one of the reasons I'm a big advocate for paid family leave, because I think it's for parental leave, because I think it's very, very important that we have an atmosphere where we nurture parents who want to have children and support them at that very critical time of the birth or adoption of a child. And there are things the government can do, like the child tax credit, which was recently expanded. There are things the government can do without intervening and trying to disrupt or control the family unit. And those are the things we can hopefully find common ground on and move forward.
Thank you. Dr. Nguyen, when you were at Baltimore Health Commissioner, you led the Be More for Healthy Babies initiative, and you started a number of initiatives for youth health and wellness, including a program for free classes for kids. How do these types of programs strengthen families, and how can they be scaled in other cities?
I appreciate the question, Kelly, and I just wanted to respond to something that Senator Santorum also said just now, which is about finding common ground. I very much agree with that sentiment, and also agree with the proposal for paid family leave. I have two young kids of my own. I have an 8-month-old daughter and a 3-year-old son, and can certainly attest on a personal level, as well as from a lot of public health literature, about why paid parental leave and time and resources for caregiving is so critical. So speaking about the work in Baltimore, so Be More for Healthy Babies, the program that you mentioned, Kelly, is still there, is a program that involves over 150 public and private partners that aim towards one goal, which is reducing infant mortality, by having nurses and social workers come and do home visits, by providing free cribs and housing and food resources, and teaching on the ABCs of safe sleep. We were able to reduce infant mortality in our city by 38% in a 7-year period. And critically, because one of the areas of focus was on health equity, we also reduced the disparity between Black and white infant mortality in that same period by more than 50%. And I think, to your point about how you can scale this up, I think this is one example of sometimes the problems that we face can seem really big. When we talk about social determinants and everything is related to one another, sometimes people can think, well, what can I do? Where do I even begin? Well, there are things that one can do in partnership when everybody is focused on one North Star. And another example of a program that I was very proud of was our Vision for Baltimore program, that I am all for research and science, but I don't need another study to tell me that if kids cannot see, they can't read, and that glasses are a really cheap and simple intervention that can make a huge difference in the trajectory of a child's life. And so we started this program to provide vision screenings, eye exams, glasses free of charge for every child in our public schools, K through 8. And got the glasses also delivered to the kids. Every step was done right in the schools, so that the child doesn't have to miss class, and parents and caregivers don't have to miss work. And I think there are programs like that, again, something simple can make a big difference. And I just hope as we go forward, we see that there's no better investment that we can make than in early childhood.
Dr. Nguyen, when you were working on this program, Be More for Babies in Baltimore, was there a bipartisan approach that enabled you to continue that program? How did you work with the state and the federal government, for that matter, in those types of programming to assist Baltimore?
Yeah, so I think the collaboration is critical. We had many people who were involved in this. We had your traditional people in healthcare, so hospitals and insurers, but also really critically recognizing the role of faith communities in our city. And in general, we also had pastors and religious organizations and nonprofits that were doing work on the ground also work with us as well. And I think it's that type of collaboration that is really critical. And in finding common ground on the approaches that everyone can agree to. There's going to be the 10, 20% or more of things that people may not agree to, but there's a lot that we can find consensus around. And I am a pragmatist. I think we need to move forward, not let perfect be the enemy of the good, but certainly also not let some pie in the sky ideals get in the way of actually delivering what's needed for residents in our city and in the country.
Thank you. Senator Santorum, do you believe that after the pandemic is over, and we hope that it will be over soon, that there will be more of a desire to support those policies that support families and support children? And how do we find bipartisan consensus to do that?
Well, to say that this has been a partisan time over the last, frankly, I thought I was in a partisan time when I was in the United States Senate back, 15 years ago. But really, since then, it's just keeps getting worse and worse and worse, and it's very disturbing because there are serious problems that the Congress needs to attend to, and there seems to be a zero-sum game that's being played, frankly, by both sides of the aisle when it comes to this. And the tone that Joe Biden has sent so far has, by and large, been good. I can take issue with a couple of things that he's done and a couple of points that he's made, but overall, I think the tone has been a good tone for the president-elect, and we'll wait and see whether he follows through with that. I mean, part of it is, how can each side stand up to the extremes of the party and find a compromise? I mean, I mentioned paid family leave before. I mean, it's a classic example. There is a path to get a bill done. It will not be everything that the left wants, and it will be more than probably what many on the right want. But I think there's a core there. There's a middle that can make it happen. And the question is whether the president is able to corral the House to adopt that type of approach, and whether Leader McConnell can do the same in the Senate. And that candidly is I always say, family's a good place to start. I mean, that's an area that most people agree is an important thing in our society and shouldn't be a partisan issue. And so I'm sort of hopeful that that's maybe one of the things they bring up early on in the administration.
So you, just to follow up on that, you mentioned the paid family leave, you mentioned the child care tax credit. What are some other programs and policies that you think that now would be a good time to support in Congress? Any workforce initiatives or apprenticeship initiatives? What do you think would really strengthen families?
Yeah, I think one of the things that, if you look at the election, the people voted against Donald Trump, but they didn't vote against a lot of the things that Donald Trump was really pushing for. And one of the things that I think was really key is his push for middle income workers, manufacturing and service employees, and apprenticeships, and creating opportunities for non-college educated people to get the skills they need so they can have livable wages and support their families. And I think that's an opportunity. I think if there's one thing the Republican Party has started orienting toward, it's more toward those types of I wrote a book back in 2014 called Blue Collar Conservatives. And I really believe that the Republican Party needed to change. And now I would make the argument that the Republican Party is changing. And I would make the argument the Democratic Party changed and has moved away from middle income people and more toward the tech economy and the wealthy suburbanites and a lot of issues that don't resonate with lower and middle income people. And so there's an opportunity for both sides, because a lot of Democrats are saying what I just said. And I think there's an opportunity for both sides to sort of prove that they get the problems of middle America, and not just the sort of the ideological issues that both sides seem to want to push more fervently.
Thank you. Dr. Nguyen, you mentioned the disparity that we see in early childhood. Can you talk about, given the amount of stress and uncertainty on families right now, can you talk about the social emotional impact and development of young children, especially during this time?
Well, certainly, and I think that that's the focus on children and families. Certainly, should be an area that we can find bipartisan solutions around. In particular, just to the point that Senator Santorum made, I think we really should be getting away from these ideological discussions too. That we should be focused on what is it that we can do, that families are suffering right now. And so let's come up with those compromise solutions for how to help families rather than have some random academic conversations about values and beliefs. But let's talk about what we can do right now. I think when I think about this, the question that you posed about what are children going through and the effects on children, we think about the hierarchy of needs. When we have so many families that are going hungry, when we have families that are being evicted and don't have stable housing, those are the issues that we have to address. It's very hard for children to focus on their intellectual development and schooling when they don't know if they're going to have a roof over their heads that night and when their families are going hungry. Then we also have to consider that we are rounding on now nearly 300,000 deaths from coronavirus in this country. We have where at some point we're going to reach this unimaginable metric of 20 million COVID-19 infections, which could well happen in January. And we have to think about all those individuals who are impacted, including the children who are impacted, even though children themselves tend to not get as ill as adults do. Children will have grandparents that have died. They'll have parents that may now be permanently have a disability because of coronavirus, and we need to address those effects as well. Children are resilient, but we have to prioritize the supports for children and families moving forward. And I hope as we do this, we'll have an emphasis on equity and recognize that what we need to do is really hard. But as a society, we just have to do it. And when I look around and I see local leaders and mayors and county executives and governors who are doing all these things, I hope that Congress and the Biden administration and really people in the federal government should take a book out of what's happening on the local and county level and see that there are a lot of people who are able to work together and come up with creative, direct, and practical solutions for the people that they serve.
Senator Santorum, since this has been an issue that has been pivotal in your career, can you talk about what you plan to do to move this conversation forward in the next administration, how you personally plan to lend your name to this cause to move these issues around families, the middle class, the workforce, and children, what your plan is in the next 4 years?
Well, a couple of things. Number one, there are a couple of issues that I'm going to continue to be engaged in early childhood work, and certainly, as I mentioned before, I'm leading the task force at BPC on paid family leave, so that's very much a passion of mine. I'm going to continue to try to see if we can find a middle ground on that. But really, getting back to what I said before, I think it's important that we have people within both political parties that try to ground the party in what is workable from a practical point of view for the people in this country who are being left behind by this new economy. We have lots of billionaires and multimillionaires being created in this country, and I think that's a wonderful thing. I don't think it's a bad thing. I don't want to punish people. I'll applaud the people who are making dynamic and fruitful changes to our economy. But we have to make sure that when a rising tide, I always said a rising tide lifts all boats unless your boat has a hole in it. And we have millions of Americans with holes in their boats. And so when the tide rises, it's a frightening thing because now you're not in shallow water, now you're in deep water. And that can be a scary thing. And you see everybody else sailing around and doing well, and you're sort of bailing water all the time. And so now, again, I don't think that people are by and large envious of the people sailing around, but they want to be able to see that, share in that success. And so my effort is going to be certainly within my own ranks to make sure that we don't drift away from some of the advances we've made, and focus in on things like you mentioned, apprenticeships and family programs and things that aren't just about cutting taxes and cutting regulation. I'm for those things. Don't get me wrong. I'm a Republican. I'm for those things, but there's more to it than that to make sure that those boats, all those boats, survive and do well on a rising tide.
Thank you. And Dr. Nguyen, I'd like to pose the same question to you, because you have spent your career in public health, being very concerned about these issues. How do you plan to spend the next 4 years of this administration moving this issue forward?
Well, I think it's important for us to finally acknowledge the role of public health. I think that, there's a saying that public health saved your life today, you just don't know it. But I actually think that with this pandemic, everyone now knows the cost of neglecting public health. It's been a major challenge every time we had any kind of budgets that we were talking about Be More for Healthy Babies, this incredibly effective program that we proved to be life-saving as well as substantially reduced cost, because we also reduced the number of preterm babies and low birth weight babies who needed intensive care, as an example. But this program kept on getting cut year after year. And there was never funding for programs like these because people don't see the impact of what didn't happen. If by definition, public health works when you prevented something, it's very difficult to say, well, you need to fund that thing that you literally didn't see. And so I hope to be spending my time too elevating the role of public health, explaining why investing in children, investing in prevention, that is what we need to do to build a healthier, more equitable society. I think there's a lot more work to be done here, and I look forward to a bipartisan, nonpartisan, collaborative approach to moving forward our shared priorities.
Well, thank you. I cannot thank you both more. Senator Rick Santorum, Dr. Lena Nguyen. I'd now like to introduce my colleague at the Bipartisan Policy Center, Linda Smith, who leads the Early Childhood Initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. And I'm looking forward to the conversation that we're about to have. Dr. Nguyen actually brought up something that we all know, and that is that the COVID-19 experience has exposed what many in early childhood have known for a long time, and that is the very fragile nature of our child care infrastructure in this country. It also exposed the struggles of everyday Americans to find childcare, to understand what needs to be done to balance work and family life in this country. So I think the conversation that we're about to have is going to narrow down now and look at more of the issues around early childhood, childcare, how we build back a better system from what we've learned during these times. I think if there's one thing that we know that remains a bipartisan issue in this Congress, it's childcare and early childhood. As we now know, they're right now debating the latest supplemental, and childcare is one of the few things that is still in there. Albeit not enough funding in there for what we need. It is there, and it is one of the things that people, by and large, understand that we need to take care of. So what we need in this country is parents need to have access to higher quality care that they can afford, and care that meets the needs of their families. It is pretty simple. So what we have is a system that has been failing us over the last several years. And the COVID experience has just shown us that it's very close to collapsing in some ways. So what we're going to do now is talk to three experts and very dear friends of mine from around the country who have looked at this issue from different perspectives. So I want to introduce the panel and then have a conversation with them about where do we go from here, and how do we keep early childhood and early learning as a bipartisan issue in these times. And I think that there's opportunities if we can just take advantage of them. So the three panelists that I'm going to introduce right now, Walter Gilliam, who is a longtime friend, who is a professor at Yale University in the School of Medicine, as well as director of the Ed Ziegler Child Study Center. Next, Ralph Smith, who is, again, a longtime friend and colleague and managing director of the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. And finally, Dana Suskind, a pediatrician from the University of Chicago, and founder and director of 30 Million Words, and I think has done an awful lot in terms of setting up a new center for early learning in addition to the work she already does, which is amazing to me. So I'm going to start with you, Dana, and talk to you a little bit about some of the issues around parents. Your work with the 30 million word gap has really had an enormous impact on the national psyche, if you will. They definitely have, have a better understanding of the importance of the first few years of life and what that means. Your recent work has focused more closely and narrowly on parents, and I'm curious as to why you made that, or why you have narrowed your focus a little bit, what you've learned, and describe a little bit of your current work for us. Dana, I think you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me on this panel. It is a real honor. My work focuses on parents for one simple reason. Science has identified parents and caregivers as the key architects of foundational brain development. It's as simple as that. So despite this fact, most early childhood efforts focus on the children rather than the adults in their lives, especially in the first few years of life, which means that parents and caregivers are an untapped resource with the incentive and capacity really to make a huge difference. So my colleagues and I at the TMW Center, we develop tools and interventions that really place parents and caregivers at the center of their children's early learning. And over the past 10 years, I have seen time and time again that parents are eager to use the tools and want to do everything in their power to help their children develop optimally. But yet, what I've found is that almost all parents face obstacles in makes it incredibly difficult to do so. In this country, it is difficult to parent in the early years for everyone, and almost impossible for a segment of the population. So over time, I've come to realize that parents don't just need information and tools to build their children's brains. They need the social supports and policies to allow them to do so. So I've moved beyond sort of just the language gap to really focusing on the need for a more comprehensive public health approach to early childhood, really one that gives children and parents what they need during the early years. So at the TMW Center, we're developing tools and technologies to facilitate scaling, piloting community-wide approaches to early learning, really to help lay the groundwork for the vision, but knowing we need much more than just telling parents, look, go talk to your children.
Mm-hmm. Dana, we've talked about this in the past, and I know that you have thoughts on this. I think you say parents and caregivers. And so I'd like you to just talk a little bit more about the caregiver aspect of this in terms of, are you thinking about caregivers in childcare programs, et cetera? And then also, parents don't seem in our country to have much of a voice when it comes to policy debates and discussions. And I continue to struggle with, how do we engage parents in a meaningful way so that if we build a new system back, if we try to rethink childcare in America, we make sure that it's responding to parents' needs. So I'd like your thoughts on both of those, if you could.
Yes. Let me tackle or approach the second part of the question first, and then circle back to the first. So you're absolutely right. I think all of us can see clearly that education, early childhood, and certainly parents have been really missing from many of the policy debates. And I think it's because policymakers and even parents at some level think that the incredible power of parents is really the end of the story, and that societal supports aren't necessary, or in some way infringe on the deeply personal endeavor of what we know as parenting. But we all, especially through this time of COVID, we know this couldn't be further from the truth, that societal supports, in fact, empower parents to be able to parent in the ways that they so desire. But this historical truth has led many parents in this country not to demand from society and from government what it is they need to build the next generation of citizens. So, that's the most important thing. In terms of the early child caregivers, I mean, certainly any adult is a child's brain builder. And certainly, I talk about biologic parents, but certainly, early child care providers are a critical part of the story. But we can't forget that at the end of the day, parents are their children's key architects. They are their parents, and early childcare is there to support parents in what they desire for their children. And sometimes I think we sort of get things mixed up. There's no doubt that the childcare system is an important part of the economic stool. It is an infrastructure in this country that allows much more than just taking care of our children and building their brains. But we can never forget that parents are the key to all of this. And so I'm hoping that this moment of COVID, that has not only shown how unsustainable it is for families, may be a real opportunity to leverage public demand and bipartisan support for solutions to the child care crisis, for the support of parents. We can't let this opportunity to go to waste. As a friend said, if not now, I'm not sure when. And, we can't forget one last thing, that the brain science can not only inform what we need to do at an individual level for parents and caregivers, but it can actually shine a light, a North Star, to borrow Lena Wynn's language, to how we rebuild better. Because at the end of the day, it's about building our next generation.
Mm-hmm. I think that one of the things that we also know as we think this through is that we need to do a better job, not just of engaging parents, but of thinking how we transition children through all of the services and the things that we do. And I want to turn now to Ralph, because Ralph, you've been working for years on the campaign for grade level reading, and you've had a lot of success around the country with a lot of communities now rethinking this and thinking about how do we really make sure that children arrive at school ready and are successful and actually meet some of these goals that we set for grade level reading at third grade and beyond. Can you describe what you've seen in communities around America about how do communities come together in your mind, and what is it that brings them together, or who? How have you done this work at a community level that gets people engaged in understanding all of this?
Linda, thanks so much for including me in this conversation and really giving us a chance to talk a bit about the campaign for grade level reading, which began on early school success as measured first by the Gateway Scale of Reading, and has explicitly expanded to look at early math as well. And because of that work, we have taken a prenatal to third grade approach to children. And what we find in communities, and especially among the educators, is a growing appreciation for what the science says about early brain development. There is today a growing commitment to doing what we can to ensure brain building. And that is very different from a decade ago. In part, that commitment is driven by the pressure of the increased scrutiny and accountability that's come with the demand around grade level reading. But there's a growing understanding in the K-12 space that there's a supply chain challenge, and that if the children who come to pre-K and kindergarten are already so far behind that it's going to be expensive, it's going to be difficult, and in all too many cases, it's going to be impossible for those children to catch up. And as a consequence, what we find is a growing willingness to go upstream. And in this case, to look at younger and younger children, to reconceptualize the work not as a sprint, but really as a relay in which we've got to pay attention to the handoff. I see a growing respect among educators for the very young children and educators for children in the early grades, a growing respect for each other and for what they have to contribute. And I must say, when we get to the early grade educators, there's a grudged respect for the early educators and for the early educators' grasp of the need for relationships and routines, which build resilience, for the skills, the life skills, which the executive function, which are about focus and self-control and making conversation and perspective taking, those things that Ellen Galinsky get us all talking about. And what I see are professionals on both sides of the issues really gravitating toward understanding that adults have a role in creating safe spaces and places for kids, and that if they're going to fulfill their role, they've got to essentially do more in terms of professional development, and that this doing more to ensure developmentally appropriate practice will have to be intentional, it'll have to be ongoing, and it'll have to be pretty inclusive. So there's a growing excitement, a growing awareness, and a growing commitment for taking a long view and looking at the prenatal to third or prenatal to 9 or 10 as a continuum which should be addressed as such and strengthened and such. And that's a really good thing over the last decade.
Ralph, in your work, I've noticed, I've seen your work evolve over the years, and it's seen exactly what you say, where you continually, it's like walking the dog back to the source and trying to figure out where all this starts. And it does start in the earliest years, as I think everybody on this call knows. My question for you is, you've also, I think, begun to focus more on parents as well in your work. And how we engage parents. And I think you use one word that in some of what you talk about is, let's have more investments, deeper investments, more intentionality in our work with parents, but also less judgment of parents. And I think those are important things for all of us to think about. What do you mean when you say?
In many respects, many of us in the field and in the larger community have a narrative about parents that communicates that many parents, especially low-income parents and low-income parents of color, are not worthy of their children. That they may have made bad choices with their own lives, and as a consequence, cannot be trusted to make good choices for their children. And that narrative, which is one of judgment and blame, and a willingness to substitute our judgment for the judgment of parents with respect to their own children, is at the root of decades of policies which are run around, end around, work around the parents of kids. And that, for the last several decades, has resulted in an underinvestment in the parents themselves. And I think as we've seen this reverse exodus, not just from childcare centers and K-12 institutions, but from institutions of higher learning, this reverse exodus back to home, back to families, and back to parents, we now see that we are having to entrust the care and the learning of these children to the people we've sought to avoid. That's kind of one of the ironies of the pandemic. And it's now making a case that we have to invest to equip parents to do what they want to do, and that is to be seen as co-producers of good outcomes for their kids, and to be seen as essential partners in working with and for their children. We have to invest in helping parents envision bold goals for their own children. We have to invest in supporting and equipping parents to achieve those goals. And we've got to invest in helping parents to mark progress and to celebrate success. And we've got to invest in ways that valorize agency, self-efficacy of parents. And that requires a very, very different narrative than the one we have. And the new narrative we need has got to be one that is driven by empathy. That all of us, if we tell our own best versions of our worst moment as parents, will appreciate that parenting is the hardest job for which we were all woefully underprepared. And even those of us who are privileged and those of us with resources mess it up as often as we get it right. And if we keep that in mind, I think we'll be more patient, more supportive, less judgmental of parents who, with challenges that we cannot imagine, are doing the best they can for the kids they love.
Wow, that was so eloquently said. Unbelievable. Thank you, Ralph. I want to switch to Walter now, because Walter, we touched a little bit on some of the issues around equity and so forth. And I know that a lot of your research has looked at this issue of expulsion of children from preschool programs, which I have to say, it blows my mind every time I listen to you talk about this, that we are expelling from programs children 3 and 4 years old, and what a life path we set them on when that happens. I want you to talk, if you will, a little bit more about the research you're doing, and talk a little bit about the role of teachers, and how do we begin to turn around sort of this whole cycle that we're in, where if a child has challenging behaviors, and I maintain that most of the time those are just developmentally appropriate behaviors, but we haven't trained our teachers to do the right thing. But beyond that, how do we begin to turn this around? I mean, just the idea of kicking kids out of these programs at 3 and 4 just sends me over the edge. What are your thoughts on this one?
Well, I right now I feel like I'm the Rockefeller of thoughts on this topic. I don't even know where to start on a topic like that. But let me start here by one, thanking you so much for inviting me onto this panel, and to hearing all the people who are talking before me. Amen to everything that they've already said, and it's amazing to me listening to them how consistent the message has been. From doctors, from lawyers, from political figures, from I think many of us parents, all saying very similar things, that if you care deeply about children, the only way to really support children is by supporting the adults that are wrapped around those children. That's how we support children. We support children by supporting the people who have meaningful roles in the lives of children. That means parents, it means pediatricians, It means their teachers, their childcare providers, all of these adults. I started studying children in childcare programs many years ago, and I was mostly interested in that time at how it is that we get children into high quality programs where meaningful learning can happen and where good supports for families can happen. And then it became evident to me that it's not just about making sure that children get in the front door of opportunity, it's also about making sure they don't get pushed out the back door of opportunity too. And that's when I became concerned about children being expelled from preschool programs. And like you said just a few minutes ago, Linda, in many cases, it's really not for much of a behavior at all. It's for children being children. But then when you look a little bit closer at the data and some of the things that we collected, not only on the one hand did we find that our Black children, our boys, our larger children in preschool programs were more likely to be expelled from preschool programs, but also in addition to that, our teachers who reported higher levels of job stress, our teachers who reported and screened positive for depression themselves, those were the teachers that were most likely to be expelling children. The expulsion is not the problem, it's a symptom of the problem. And the underlying problem is that we have childcare providers who in many cases have a lot of stress that they're dealing with in their own lives. And in many cases, they need support, they need help, they need assistance, just like parents. When we were hearing just a few minutes ago about how all of us have our not so shining moments as parents, we all have not so shining moments as teachers too, and not so shining moments as child providers. And if the supports are made available when they're needed, then that doesn't necessarily have to end up with a child being kicked out of a preschool program. Children being expelled from preschool programs at literally 3 times the rate of grades K through 12 combined, and childcare programs at about 13 times the rate of K through 12 combined. So I was studying, children getting kicked out of preschool programs and the racial disparity involved in that, and the stress that causes for children and families, and the stress in providers that caused it in the first place. And then all of a sudden the pandemic happened, and literally every one of our children got expelled from preschool. They got expelled from K through 12. So now we're all finding ourselves in a very similar kind of boat. And so maybe right now is the time to be thinking about how do we restructure our supports better. I'm going to say this at the risk of offending the pamphlet industry, but teachers don't need another pamphlet. They don't need another webinar in many cases. What they need is in-the-moment supports that can remind them about the important things that we can teach them through pamphlets and webinars, but to just give them that information when they don't need it and not provide them the supports when they do, that's where we're missing the boat. So we've been focusing in my shop on early childhood mental health consultation. How do we make available the mental health supports that are already available in many communities and place them into childcare programs where they can be a source of prevention? And what's interesting about this, when you think about it, is that the reality for many children when they get expelled is they get expelled from one childcare program, and then their parents need the care in order to be able to go to work. So they go to another childcare program where they might get expelled, and they get expelled again, and eventually they end up in a child guidance clinic someplace. What if instead of expelling the children from preschool programs, we expelled the clinicians out of their child guidance clinics and put them in the childcare programs? That was basically the model that we were looking at. And now we have statewide random controlled trials, first in Connecticut, and now a recently released statewide random control trial in Ohio that shows, in fact, it can work. Not only can it work, but in Ohio, what we found was not only improvements for the children who prompted the request for the mental health supports, but also for the bystander children. Because the idea behind it is supporting the provider to be a better source of stress mitigation, a better source of social emotional supports for all of the children in their care. We will never be able to get ahead of the mental health needs for our children and families by trying to help them one child or one family at a time. We need to be able to find solutions that place within our childcare providers and our teachers a better understanding of how to be able to be more successful for all of our children going forward.
some of the structural issues around childcare have never been so out there as they are right now in our country, with many of our childcare programs and our teachers and our providers just literally out there by themselves. I think one of the interesting things, and we have a lot of conversations, I'd be interested in all of your reaction to this. I mean, we know that we have a workforce that's severely underpaid and ill-trained to do the work that they're doing. I mean, I think that there's probably not an awful lot of question about that. And so, but the question really is that we can't do much about the teacher pay, the caregiver pay in our childcare programs, because if we do that, we raise the fees to parents, and they simply can't pay any more money than they're already paying. So whether it's in the early years or even in the after school programs, this is a problem that is shared across the board. What do you think we need to do as a country to fix some of this, to get the pay to the teachers and the training to the teachers that they need, so that we don't have these things happening, and at the same time make it so parents can get access to these programs where they can afford them? I think we're just stuck as a country, and this is one of the things that I think Congress is beginning to understand. So what do you guys think here? What do we do with the workforce? What do we do with this piece of it? Walter, we'll start back with you.
Sure. I think one of the things to remember is that, childcare providers are doing an incredible amount of work. I mean, they work incredibly long hours. And during this pandemic, when a lot of other programs were closed and schools were closed, many childcare providers were still coming to work in order to be able to provide safe as possible care for our children. And they do it for about half the pay of a kindergarten teacher, and none of the benefits. In many cases, no health care, no retirement, no sick pay, placing many of them in a position where they have to decide whether or not to come into work potentially sick or stay at home and not get paid, because they're not salaried workers in most cases, they're hourly workers. So I think on the one hand, we have to keep that reality. And now this next thing that I'm going to say might come across sounding a little strange, but childcare is not expensive. Childcare is not expensive. When you look at the number of care hours that are provided and you compare it to school or anything else, it's actually fairly cheap. The difference is that we don't subsidize it. It's not that childcare is expensive, it's just that the majority of the cost, almost all of the cost, is passed down to the parents who can't afford it. And so the solution here really isn't to try to figure out how to make childcare cheaper. We can't do that without paying under people who are already being underpaid. What the solution really needs to be is that we need to be thinking about childcare as the infrastructural support that it is, and investing in our children and families so that families can go to work. We've created an economy that requires parents to work. And what we need to do, whether it's based on the economy or whether we're thinking about pandemics, is together think about how do we subsidize the infrastructural supports for families that are needed in order to hold our children harmless. Hold our children harmless to the demands of an economy, hold our children harmless to the demands of a pandemic.
I see that we're running out of time, and I have one question that I actually ask each of our panelists to think about in anticipation of this panel, and the fact that we tend to get a lot of policymakers paying attention to these events. So in your minds, if you could tell Congress in the next 2 or 3 years, 1 or 2 things that they should do to support families in this country, what would they be? And Dana, let's start with you and go the other way this time. You're on mute.
So sorry. So before I jump to the next few years, just quickly, what we need the current Congress to do in the next few weeks is really to extend the benefits from the CARES Act and other protections that are set to expire. As we've talked ad infinitum about this is not just an adult issue, this is an early childhood issue, so I won't go deeply into that. But extending what Walter just stated, really viewing early childhood care and education as a vital economic infrastructure, a critical public good, akin to either highways or even continuation of public schooling, that we need to start investing in this in a universal way, as we have done in the past. So that is number one. I'm keeping them very short. The other thing I call for in the near future is a substantial direct funding to the childcare industry as it is. I mean, obviously we need to restructure it, but we need a bailout, if you will. It is not the only industry in need of support, but it's the one that props up virtually every other industry in this country. So while we need to vastly expand and improve our current childcare system in this country, in the meantime, we can't allow the one that we have to fail, that we have now to fail. So with that, I will stop.
Thank you. Ralph, how about you? Two things, one or two things.
Two.
Okay.
I think, Linda, although this has been framed as focused on working families, we really need to include within the ambit those families who have such a frail and fragile connection to the economy. They're not working, which means we've got to be able to say poverty out loud. And so I begin by saying, if we take poverty seriously as the root cause, the primary driver, actually the super spreader of the adversities which complicate virtually everything we're talking about, that the first thing we should do is to have the Congress pass legislation which would incorporate the recommendations of the National Economy's Roadmap to End Child Poverty, and it would endorse the really good work that's being done at the Bipartisan Policy Center right now, along with others. That's number one. Let's address poverty directly. And along with Walter, I would say that we need to pay attention to infrastructure. On one hand, because it creates jobs, and we need jobs if we're going to deal with poverty. And infrastructure is more than bridges and roads and rail beds. It's also childcare centers and Head Start centers and schools and public housing, and we get a double bottom line. And it is also, to go to Walter's very important point, the infrastructural supports we need for this economy is a unified system of developmentally appropriate care for the folks we hope will essentially take care of us in the future. And we have two very incomplete systems right now. For the very young children, we call it childcare, and for other kids, we call it school. And that distinction means that we subsidize them differently, we think them differently, and we create a near impossible situation. Suppose we just say we need developmentally appropriate custodial care for kids from the time they're born until the time they get close enough to adulthood that we can have them fend for themselves. And if we saw it as a unified system, some of the problems we have would go away. And lastly, and I can't leave without saying this, I owe this to the folks on the ground, because it's not about legislation, it's about regulation. The folks on the ground who are trying to do this work need regulations which will lower the barriers to collaboration. We need collaboration to start at the top. And we need regulations which will allow for data integration, for common notions of eligibility and the like. And we ought not to essentially have people on the ground trying to put things together that have been, by legislation and regulation, put into separate camps, separate funding streams, separate directives, and the like. We are making the work on the ground so much harder than it needs to be. And although it's not the sexy legislative proposals, we ought to get about the kind of regulatory reform which will allow good work to happen by people who don't have to do heroic things. You shouldn't have to be depend on strong relationship and a joint commitment to treason to be able to do the work that you need to do on the ground.
Right. Okay, well, we're out of time. So Walter, I'm going to give you one more thing to say. You'll be it, and we have about 30 seconds to say one more thing you think policymakers should be listening to.
Do everything that Mr. Smith and Dr. Susskind just said. Focus on supporting early care and education as a key infrastructure, and then allowing parents to be able to pick up the difference on a sliding fee scale in order to be able to pay our parents, our providers better, and also focus on the fact that a lot of our infrastructure already exists. It's just wrongly deployed. Instead of taking mental health care providers and keeping them in community guidance clinics and pediatricians there, find ways to build better bridges into our schools and into our child care programs, because that's where the children are.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to thank this panel so much. We could have gone on for another hour on this, and these are such thoughtful people. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you spending your time with us today, and you're really taking this issue very seriously. I want to thank those in the audience who joined us, and hopefully you will continue to tune in to the Solution Summit. We have another session going on tomorrow at 2:00 where we will look at families in need and spend a little bit more time on some of the tax issues in the family leave policy. So with that, we're going to call it a day. And again, hope that everyone has a lot to think about as we move forward into a new Congress with hopefully a lot of possibilities to come together and do something good for our children and families. So thank you to everyone.